Hello everybody, I am Joseph Wafer. Welcome to my channel. Here I mostly talk about lighting and compositing with regards to visual effects and try and give you tips and methodologies that you can utilize in your workflow. So today I'm going to be talking about this heat distortion effect that I used in one of my personal projects. I feel it really added a lot of visual interest, texture, and layering to a shot that was otherwise pretty stagnant and plain. So I'm going to show you kind of my thought process and how I went through that. So here is my Nuke scripting tree. You can see these primary smaller trees that I have running the heat distortion. This one on the left controls the more large distortion, which you can see very prominently here. And this one on the right controls the more subtle, noisy, smaller heat distortion waves. And you can really see off the bat how this can add texture to an otherwise plain image. You can very easily, without the distortion, tell that this is a CG 3D model of this ship, but with the distortion, it really helps hide that and sell this shot. On top of that, if we go back to our video, it also adds a sort of foreground element to this shot where you can kind of see heat distortions rippling close to the camera, and it helps to add these layers. So I'm going to walk you through how I kind of added this distortion. So as with most things in visual effects, I started with a noise pattern, right? But one thing I found is if I leave the noise stagnant, this is an early version of the shot, you'll notice, particularly here in the foreground, that the noise, the distortion itself, is very inaccurate to how it would look in real life. It almost looks like the lens itself is distorted, rather than the environment and the air, right? So I had to animate this noise. And not only that, I had to animate it using a shuffle node within the red and the green channels. This would allow me to have two separate channels, which for the most part followed the same principles. Then, once combining them, I wanted to multiply it to really emphasize this noise. And when it's moving, it looks like this. What I personally found is that the faster the noise is animated in the Z-axis, which is what I chose, I found that worked best. I found the faster it's animated, the more it sells the distortion effect. Obviously, I'm sure you can go too far with this, but for me, faster was better. After this, I used a shuffle node to send the red and green channels to the UV channels, because you can use the UV channels within the distortion node to drive the distortion itself. And so that's the primary way that I was able to get this distortion going. And so I'll talk about here the main difference between the more subtle and larger heat distortion waves here. The main difference is that our transform nodes have different scale values. In the larger heat distortion waves, I multiplied the scale of the noise by 1.01, and I found that this was just enough to get the levels that I needed. Because you'll see, if I compare this, the noise looks super different. Right, the more subtle noise and the larger noise look completely different just by changing this one scale value. On top of that, the other main driver is in the distort nodes themselves in the UV scale, right? Because the UV is what I used to drive the distortion levels. So that's the main process I went through to get this effect, and I found that it really added to an otherwise plain shot. So I hope my thoughts and my thought process on this effect is able to help you, because one thing I find is that us artists in visual effects can tend to rely on things like film grain or lens flares or things like that to add these layers or texture, and it's nice to have these other tools we can go to where something like this doesn't just have to represent heat, it can also add these really interesting layers. So I hope this helps you and gives you some different perspective or ideas for some of your shots. Thanks for watching.